Welcome to the Marin Women's Hall of Fame. I'm Jana Childers. We're talking tonight about 1998 inductee into the Hall of Fame, Elizabeth Thacher Kent. Elizabeth Thacher Kent lived between the years of 1868 and 1952 and is a posthumous inductee into the Hall of Fame. And so we are joined in this program by two people who know her well and who will help us get to know her. This is Molly Kent Sharp and Eleanor Kent, granddaughters of the inductee. Welcome to the Marin Women's Hall of Fame.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
I understand that you were both able to attend the festivities in March where your grandmother was inducted into this society.
Yes, indeed.
How did that feel for the Kent family?
Oh, I think it felt like a very, very wonderful reward, and it was a wonderful opportunity for us to remember again what a wonderful person she'd been and what an influence on our lives in different ways she had been.
Were a number of the family, a number of her descendants able to attend?
Oh yes, there were about 2 or 2.5 tables full of people, maybe 20 or so. And what was nice was that the younger generation came too, and boys and girls both.
Molly, tell us what your grandmother was best known for.
Well, probably in the world at large, best known for her work in the suffrage movement, women's suffrage. She started this in sort of 1910, helped with the California suffrage amendment in 1911, and then when her husband also became a congressman in 1910 and they'd moved to Washington, D.C., she became very active in the women's suffrage movement in Washington.
So when your grandmother Elizabeth came to California, to Marin County in 1907?
1907, yes.
In 1907, women still did not have the vote.
Not
Correct.
in California. In some states they did. And at that point, the amendments were going state by state. I think it was either Montana or Wyoming, which was first. The West was better off in this direction than the East or the South. But the California amendment, which did pass in 1911 and gave women the right to vote in California, was the first that had passed in quite a number of years. So it was a very exciting new energy into the women's movement.
So for something like 4 years, she worked hard to make that happen.
I'm not sure when she started, because I don't think it was necessarily something she was doing right away, or at least I don't have records of that. She mentioned one place that the first procession, the first parade for women's votes that she was in 1910 in New York, where her best friend lived. And I think that having a really good friend who was also interested in this helped her become courageous and go out and do this campaigning, because it's kind of scary to get out and stand on street corners and ask people to vote for this. She had one wonderful story of standing at a ferry boat landing and passing out literature, vote for women, and a German man went up and then he came rushing back with the paper and threw it back at her and said, "Der Women's, they belong in der kitchens." And she told that often. She just loved that.
It's a great story. It's a great story. How is it, do you know that she came to Marin County? We said she came in the very early part of the century.
William Kent moved out with his father in the late 19th century, 1871. They came out and bought this piece of property which Adeline Kent, his mother, William's mother, had said was paradise. She had found paradise, and so they bought the Kentfield Valley, which is now Kent Woodlands. And the young William Kent was brought up there doing a lot of hiking and hunting and things in the hills, and schooling was not in good shape here, and so he was sent back to Hopkins Grammar School in New Haven to get good prep school education before going to Yale, which was sort of a family tradition. So when he was sent to New Haven, Mr. Albert Kent sent a letter to his friend Thomas Thacher to say, "Would you please look after my son who's going back there to school?" And it turned out that William lived with the Thachers, and Elizabeth is Elizabeth Thacher, and she met him kind of living in her household. And then when he died, when Thomas Thacher died, just a little bit after William had graduated from Yale and was managing the family business in Chicago, she moved out to the Ojai, where her brothers had moved before, and they moved there. So when William and Elizabeth decided to get married, they were married in the Ojai, and then went to Chicago to live for the first 17 years of their life. And all their children were born there.
And they came out to Kentfield every summer by train with all the children and nurses and people, and they would come out from Chicago and spend the summer in Kentfield or in the Ojai Valley and Thacher.
And eventually, when all the children had been born, but several of the children were still quite small, they decided to move out here.
Yes. My father, who was the youngest, was born in 1906, and they moved in 1907. So the youngest ones were really educated and grew up out here, whereas the oldest ones have more memories of Chicago and learning to skate and things with Granny.
Yes. If we say that Elizabeth got involved in the women's working for the right to vote movement somewhere between 1907 and 1910, she was patient for several years, wasn't she? She worked sort of quietly to begin with.
Perhaps so. Right.
Her first round of activity was just after her husband was elected to the Congress.
Correct.
And what was it that she did in those early years in Washington?
She was asked by the National American Women's Suffrage Association, I think Nancy Nakai calls that NAWSA, which is a little easier than that mouthful of words, to be the congressional chairwoman, which was a person who was to get a federal amendment in front of the government to both houses of Congress and be sure that hearings were slated for this. And NAWSA would find the speakers. And I think that Elizabeth did this only 1 year. And she had a big tea before it, and she commented that there was really much more active interest than she thought. Over 250 people jammed into her little house in the rain. And it was a very exciting time for her, and I think really opened her eyes to much more that was going on. She had at first said she wasn't sure she wanted to do this because she believed in doing it state by state. And NASA officials said, "Oh, don't worry, it'll never pass." And so she said, "Okay, I'll do it." But she became very, very dedicated to having the federal amendment. I think living in Washington and getting to know the temper of the different states better, she realized it wasn't going to happen to many of the states if it didn't happen at a federal level.
Yes, and it did take quite a while, didn't it?
Very long time.
By 1917, she had become a little more impatient.
Yes. Well, she was followed in the job of the congressional chairman by a much younger woman who had cut her teeth in the women's movement in England, where the whole movement was much more radical and much more militant, with standing on street corners and speaking loudly and with megaphones and barging into Parliament and going to jail and having hunger strikes and being force-fed. It was a rough and tumble thing. And Alice Paul came back with that experience and said, "We've got to get this thing moving. And you know, you've been doing this in Congress for over 40 years and nothing has happened." So she took on this job, and she was a little bit, I think, afraid to meet my grandmother. She also kind of knew that she'd been there before. She knew more of the people, but maybe she also was a little shy that she had sort of taken over the job. And when she met my grandmother, she said that she was the most amazing, most wonderful aide that anyone could ever have. And I think in her oral history, she says she was just extra, 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 extra wonderful. She just jumped in there and said, "Yes, I'll help you anyway." And primarily, she paid the rent because NASA said that Alice Paul could have the job, but there was no budget. And Granny paid the rent for the first year or so, and then founded a committee of 100 and then a committee of 200 women who would pay this rent to make sure that this really dynamic woman would be supported, because I think she realized this was the only way it was going to happen, with major publicity and
Yes, for years.
action.
For years she did that kind of work. She did tremendous committee work. She spoke at national conventions and to the Congress and lobbied people and held teas, as you said, in her house. And then finally she reached the point where that just wasn't enough.
Even-
And what did she do then?
Well, she did help the pickets.
Yes.
The women were picketing the White House, and she sent loads of hot bricks and wheelbarrows down for the women to stand on, and they were standing there silently, telling that to be noticed. And also, she sent her husband's coats down to keep them warm because it was so cold. And when was the picketing, Molly? That was in...
Picketing was in 1917. They started this. This was after one other thing that she had done. And her husband was very supportive. Her husband was, William Kent, was very much for votes for women. And he also gave speeches and was very active.
in Congress.
In Congress.
Because he was in Congress at that time.
Mm-hmm. And yet, one year, I guess in sort of 1915, 16, they had been asking Woodrow Wilson, who was Democratic president, there was a Democratic Congress, and still nothing happened. And Wilson would say, well, yes, you know, you're women, it's right, someday that has to happen, but the country's not ready. And they said, wait a minute. And so when he ran for re-election in 1916, my grandfather, William Kent, was his a kind of liaison, because he was a Republican progressive, with the Democratic Party to re-elect Woodrow Wilson. And my grandmother went and said, I am not for him. He has not done what he could do. And she conducted a campaign in California and Oregon against Wilson. And the Democratic Party tried to get William to stop her from doing this. And he said, I told them that I valued my independence so much that I could never ask you to give up yours. And if this is what you must do, that is fine. So she did. And then it was after he was reelected, and they said, okay, enough is enough, we're going to picket.
Mm-hmm. So they began in earnest, the picketing. And mostly it was standing and being cold, but sometimes things got even worse than that for your grandmother.
Well, there's a charming story. She did join the pickets eventually, and
the parade.
her son Sherman would come up when he came home from school, would join her there. And one day he came along, and as he was standing with her, a policeman came up on the other side, and he said, I have my slingshot and my BBs in my pocket. And I kind of asked my mother, should I get this guy in the posterior? And she gave a signal, definitely not. And then she turned and in a quavering voice said, and now you will see your own mother carried off in the wagon. And right at that time, the policeman picked her up and put her in the wagon and drove her off. And this was no small thing. This was quite terrifying to be there and to put yourself on that. Jail was, the women's workhouse was a really difficult, dirty, disease-ridden place. It was something you took a chance, you know, you really risked a lot to do it. However, she never did spend a night in prison because William always bailed her out. He said, you can do what you want, but I have to, in my conscience, I cannot let you spend the night in jail. So I will use my last cent if necessary to get you out.
Well, she was successful eventually, wasn't she? That was 1917 or so, during those famous picketing episodes. And what year was it when women finally got the vote?
Well, I think it passed the vote in Congress in 1919 and then had to go through all the amendment votes in all the states, and it was declared in 1920 that
Yes.
women had the vote.
Well, we can speculate what the party must have been like at your grandmother's house
Oh, yes.
in 1920. And after that, how would you say that during her 50s she was involved in the community's life? After women had finally won the great battle,
Yeah.
what did she turn her attention to?
Well, about the same time as those, by 1915, I think Jane Addams, again, her mentor in Chicago, started a women's peace movement, which became the International League, Women's League for Peace and Freedom. And she was very active in that. She also remained on the board of the National Women's Party, which is what Alice Paul's branch of the women's movement had become. Mm-hmm. So she continued that very much. And then back home in Kentfield, because William didn't run again in 1918, and he worked for another year or so in Washington on the Trade Commission, and they moved back in 1920 for good. But she hadn't finished politics quite yet because William ran for Senate, and in this campaign she campaigned much more actively than she had before. She really said, I was not afraid to get up and speak myself. Before she had supported raising money, she had gone out for things, but she had not really gotten out on the train tracks and things, on the trains with him. And this time she really did. But even so, he lost. There was a change in the spirit of the country at that time. And the Progressive Party was out, the more conservative Republican Party was taking over, and his message was not what was wanted.
But she didn't lack for interests, did she? She had a number of interests. She was one of the early people interested in conservation in this part of the country.
Yes, very much so. She and her husband together gave Muir Woods to the nation. My grandfather found that the place was going to be logged and came home and said, "We have to buy this." And she at first said, "Oh, we can't afford it." And he said, "We must." Remember?
Yes.
And what he said?
He said something like, if we lost all our money and we saved these trees, it would be worth it, wouldn't it? And she had to agree.
So,
And she did.
so her concern for the conservation and her community, starting with her family, which she really enjoyed and loved, she spread it out to the community and got involved with these playgrounds. And she had a wonderful garden that she planned. And she was a member, I think, of the garden club in Marin County. And there was a Shakespeare club. I think they ran out of Shakespeare and went to other things. But they met, and she was very involved in all the community things, and the Presbyterian orphanage with the Grape Festival, which was fascinating. They had booths and things that they had on the Kent Place to raise money for the orphanage.
And you remember taking part in some of those Grape Festival celebrations,
Oh,
Eleanor.
yes. I
And
remember.
what did you do?
Well, I had a tray full of candies, and I went around trying to sell it in costume. I think it was a great thing to get the children in costumes. And the Branson schoolgirls would come and sell brownies to raise money. And everybody was involved in different kinds of fundraising. As a child, I loved Peacock Alley because you could go and find the old clothes and put them on and wander around. And all our aunts and uncles and mothers and fathers were involved in some sort of part of the Grape Festival. Every first rainy Saturday in October, they called it. But as a child, it was wonderful going around after the Grape Festival to see what was left, finding things.
Mm-hmm. So after she was part of this great movement to win the vote for women, she turned some of her attention anyway toward the environment and some of her attention toward children, toward homeless or at least parentless children.
Right, in the Presbyterian orphanage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. She sounds like a very compassionate woman, somebody who was not just interested in her own little circle, but who had a great deal of sympathy for other people.
Oh, yes. She was a wonderful grandmother. When you stayed with her, when you talked to her, she'd listen, and she treated you as if you were real, and that extended to her grandchildren, to her children, to the community. And many people would come to her for advice or for things that, and she just listened.
Yes, yes. And what would you say, Molly, that you most admire of her many qualities?
Oh my, so many. I think her courage, her adventurousness and her courage, and her willing to keep upping her own ante, to do a little bit more, to go further than she first had thought. And her wonderful ability to combine a really gentle, gracious personality with this adventurous and tough and spirit that she also had. I think that story about her not only being a part of the picket line, but when she wasn't going down and taking care of the women who were there, was very, very much in keeping with her her really gentle, loving spirit that always came through everything.
Yes. So she was a wonderful grandmother. She made a real contribution to women, really the women of the country, as well as the people of Marin County. If you could imagine her looking back on her life, what do you think she would have been most proud of?
Well, she liked her children and her grandchildren, and she liked people, she liked justice. She really was fair. That's part of the listening, and she would make you feel that she was going to hear both sides of any question, all sides. And I think her fairness, I think she would have been pleased with what she had accomplished, but hoped to do more. That was what kept her going more and more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we say nowadays when somebody is a very contemporary and forward-looking kind of a woman, that she's a 90s kind of a woman. We could say that your grandmother was the original 90s kind of a woman.
1890s woman.
Oh, 2000. She was always
Right,
interested
nice.
in new things happening,
Yeah.
but keeping tradition. And she was interested in the church, in the Marin County churches, and she was generally in communities.
And if you had to make a guess about the source of her strength, we've said several things about her courage and her ability to persist, even over the long haul. It took a long time for women to win the right to vote. If you had to guess about where she got her strength, what would you say?
I think her upbringing, I think that she was very much inspired by her father, and her mother writes her this occasionally, you know, and you are so much like your father, you would, and she had something about, he would put his hand on the chair and said, just do right, do whatever, but do right. And I think that there was that solidity, that there was really something very substantial, and that she could do right, and that she was encouraged to be adventurous, but just have the standards to be fair and right and truthful. Truthful was very important within this adventurous spirit that she had, and maybe having all brothers, that instead of being treated just as the sissy little girl outside, she was encouraged to play and act with them, and she never felt different. So she never took on a really different sexist sort of side.
Mm-hmm.
Well, she was funny, too. I mean, she would laugh, and it wasn't all serious, but she was funny.
Yes, she was.
So maybe she learned both things early in life, and from having to
Yeah.
deal with 8 brothers, you can imagine she
Yes.
needed all of that.
Yeah.
Yes.
But
Good.
she could be very stern. If you were doing something wrong, you knew about it. And she would do things, she would tell you if you were doing something wrong and explain why that was not a good idea. And you tended to believe her.
Anything else that we need to tell about her to make sure that everything gets covered?
There's been so much, I can't.
Well, she had a gift that she gave to her children and grandchildren of I think that we all have benefited from, of women being just as good as men, or it not making a difference. You were a person, and yes, you didn't have to back off and pull your punches. You could do anything if you set your mind to it, and if you thought, well, I'd like to learn to play the violin. She said, well, there's a very nice man in San Rafael who gives lessons if you really want to do that. I mean, or some wild thing, she'd sit down and help you plan on how you do it. And that spirit came down to all the children. And the men are nice, too. They think that women are equal, too. There's a nice feeling among the family.
That's a
very
great thing.
important, yeah.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
And a lucky thing when you have it. I
Yeah.
like this idea of encouraging the next generation, not just in a general way, but specifically to find what that child is good at. Did she do that for you, Eleanor?
Yes. She was, for all of us, she was interested in what we were doing. And she was very interested when I went to college. She said sort of wistfully, I think if my father hadn't died, I would have gone to college. She said, we used to tease about blue stockings, but I think it would have been fun. And
So she encouraged you to go.
Yes. Yeah.
And how about you, Molly? Can you think of a particular thing that she saw in you and encouraged?
Well, I was much younger, and I guess I'm trying to think what in particular. I just have my feeling of going to her house and enjoying it. And I think one of the things I got from her was not only the adventurous and to explore, but also a kind of order, a lovely sort of quiet order about things. And she would, you know, have her way if you spent the night about how you got up and always had to comb your hair before having breakfast. She had a little story about her father catching her one time when she didn't and said, "Elizabeth, I don't want you ever to go to breakfast without combing your hair." And she said, "I think, honestly, I never did." But that kind of a sense of being loved and trained together, to being inspired and being helped at the same time. And that was something that I remember, was the peace of going to her house, sort of the comfort and stability of that, as well as the loving friendship and different activities that she'd have there for you to do.
A wonderful combination.
I think so.
She sounds like a great model in so many ways for young women today. We thank you for coming and sharing about Elizabeth Kent with us. And I feel that during this time that we've been talking, we've had a little sense of her spirit in the room with us. Thank you so
I
much.
think so. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.